Good morning, everyone. I think none of us who are on this morning can deny that we have been through so much uh, as a nation, uh, as well as just an extremely unique time in history. And as I didn't get to watch, I didn't get to watch the memorial this week, but I've been able to catch bits and pieces of it. But I've done a lot of reflection and thinking about what is this going to do? Now, on one hand, we see hopefully maybe young people rising up with more purpose than they've had. But what's it literally going to do to the cells of their body, to what we call cellular memory, as well as what is it going to do to future generations? There is a difference in people who are born in a time of peace and a difference of people who are born during times of famine, times of war, pestilence. And what happens, and we've sort of been going through sort of all of the above in our world. And then, especially here in America, we went through the COVID pandemic. We literally placed into the cellular memory of those children. But the scary thing, guys, is we placed into the memory of the unborn children what we cannot even yet scientifically explain. So as I worked on this morning, I mean this week, and I began to think about all uh, just in these past years that we as a nation, and this is true globally, even more seriously in countries in Africa, um, which we tend to, the evening news doesn't even usually bother to cover so often what's really going on there. But we're going to talk specifically about our own nation this morning and how traumatic events in our nation affect cellular memory, the cells in our bodies, but scientifically, it's being proven more and more that it affects the cells, the literal DNA of generations to be born. Now, my first foray into cellular memory happened while I was writing Silent Takeover. I was nearing the end of the book, and my sweet, smart daughter in law, Tori, sent me a clip and said, Mom Jackie, you're going to be so interested in this, and you may want to mention it in your book. So I read it, and now I wrote the book in 2016. I don't even know when this test was conducted, uh, but what it was concerning a scientific test that Emory University did on mice. You've heard me talk about this before, but I want you to see it here just in generalized words that makes it easy to read. So it says behavior can be affected by events and previous generations which have been passed on through a form of genetic memory, animal studies suggest. Now, we've all had this feeling of deja vu. You feel like, have I been here before? That's sort of on the same wavelength, but not exactly the same. Experiments showed that a traumatic event could affect the DNA in sperm and alter the brains and behavior of subsequent generations. Now, think about what's happened in America. How are these events going to alter the brains and behavior of subsequent generations? A Nature neuroscience study showed mice trained to avoid a smell pass their aversion on to their grandchildren. Experts say the results were important for phobia and anxiety research. And this is what happened. They took a colony of mice, put them in a cage, And they electrified three corners of the cage. One corner they did not electrify. And it didn't take very long for the mice to recognize that there was one safe corner. And they added the fragrance of cherry blossoms. So every time they were going to electrify the cage, they released the smell of cherry blossoms. And the mice, they'd electrify the cage, the mice would go crazy, they'd run around until they got into the safe corner. Then, when those mice had little baby mice, they took the baby mice away, raised them separately from mom and dad, and all they had to do was release the smell of cherry blossoms. And the mice panicked, ran to the safe corner. So this went on with them just releasing the fragrance of cherry blossoms for 4 generations. Now, when I read that, I immediately thought of the scripture, the iniquity of the fathers is visited to the 4th generation. We've sort of thought about that as individual fathers, haven't we? And I think that's certainly true. But what about a nation? What about the nation, the iniquities of the father of our generation? There's scientific proof that it can be passed on in a mouse. But what initiated the thinking? It was because people have been following the Holocaust survivors for since the Holocaust. And so many of the offsprings have not been raised with those survivors. But in tests, in medical tests and other sorts of neurological tests and everything, they respond to the same stimuli. And that's what made them start thinking, now, wait a minute, here are these children who barely even know the stories, probably, they may know some, but why would their bodies, why would their cells react to the same stimuli? And we know how a dog has instinct, don't we? You know how a pointer bird dog will actually literally use his paw and his tail to point out that's where the birds are. We call that instinct in an animal. Our collie will try to herd children and make them, well, the one we used to have, this one, I'm not sure she knows what she does, but our others, if we had little children there and they're outside playing, she'd keep herding them into the garage. They loved it, of course, but that was instinct. But there's something in the human being that is a memory that is passed on about all sorts of things. But this showed, and this was so interesting here when you read it, this is at Emory in Georgia, looked inside the sperm. They showed a section of DNA responsible for sensitivity to the cherry blossom scent was made more active. Doesn't say in the mice brains, it says in the mice sperm. Both the mice offspring and their offspring were extremely sensitive to cherry blossoms and would avoid the scent despite never having experienced it in their lives. Changes in brain structure were also found. The experience of a parent, get this, even before conceiving, markedly influence both structure and function in the nervous system of subsequent generations, the report concluded. The findings provide evidence of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, that the environment, think about how we're living right now, can affect an individual's genetics, which in turn can be passed on. Now, how many of you now, I don't want you to answer, I want you to think about it. You're in a store now, and you're thinking about, if something happens here, where do I hide? Where do I go? What do I do? You get to a mall, you're considering thoughts you would have never thought about years ago in the mall. Mall was happy place. You're at McDonald's, and you're watching the room, especially if you have little children. That is a fear. That's an anxiety. It is now built so tightly into our culture, and it is being built so tightly inside of us that it will be passed on to subsequent generations. And you're like, well, I don't plan to have any more children. I want you to think about the young people who who've not they're not yet bearing children. It, this doesn't mean that just because you're not going to have any more children, that this is not going to be passed on by millions and millions and millions, maybe billions around the world. The doctor that did this said this might be one mechanism that descendants show imprints of their ancestor. There is no doubt that what happens to the sperm and egg will affect subsequent generations. And that sperm and those eggs are stored when a baby's born, that won't become active until a certain time in their life. Another professor says the findings were highly relevant to phobias. Do we have any phobias? Well, in my family, the Smith family, we were taught to never kill an insect unless the insect was bothering us. So you could kill a fly, you could kill a mosquito. You didn't kill ants; they were good friends. You didn't kill spiders. That I didn't know we had to watch out for black widows, but out here in Missouri, we fight brown recluse all the time, and yeah, I do kill them. But for the most part, we were taught what that bug's not bothering you, and so therefore, and I'm sure some of you are smiling, you were taught the same thing. But then, as our family began to expand, um, I knew that if you didn't show fear, a bee was not going to harm you. Now, wasps are not safe in anybody's world, but some of our extended family were so afraid of bees. They were afraid of any insect. So any insect that came through the air, they were panicking. So I began to ask, were you ever stung by a bee? No. And so I began to go back, and they were taught way, way back, not even in that generation or in the generation before, but the generation before. Someone had had a pretty serious or deadly, I don't think it was deadly, but a pretty serious sting from a bee. So that was a little different. So even though we began to try to overcome that in the mind, don't show the insect fear, don't put off that chemical, there was still something already within that person, and it's most likely going to be passed on. So this doctor says, I suspect we will not understand the rise in neuropsychiatric disorders or obesity, diabetes, or metabolic disruptions generally without taking a multi-generational approach. Now, we think about that. Well, yeah, these are things that we inherit, but our cells are actually holding on to the memory from people before us. In this smell aversion study, it is thought that either some of the odor ends up in the bloodstream, which affected sperm production, or that a signal from the brain was sent to the sperm to alter DNA. Emory University, significant mouse studies. But notice the inherited response was accompanied by changes in brain structure, with the descendants having more neurons dedicated to detecting that specific scent. With our generation, these young people and children unborn, they will have more neurons that react to, I'm going to use an example, to fear in a crowd. And this gets on to a little bit more science, but you may want to go back and look for them. We know that the body, your T cells, your immune system retain a memory. But this was different. These mice in ensuing generations, you see they are saying it transmits a memory of gene repression. That baby is born with whatever post-traumatic stress disorder the parents went through, whether it is major or minor, and a lot of the events that are happening today are major. We're just getting so desensitized. And then we have to add the virtual dimension. the brain and the body cannot discern between real and virtual. The conscious brain can. Conscious brain in a video game can go, oh, these are not real people. Uh, these are pictures. They're images. And you can kill as many of them as you want to because they're going to pop right back up. Kill them, pop right back up. The brain, though, responds to anything virtually like that in a number of ways. One, it begins to change the cellular expression of those genes, especially the neurons in the brain. It also causes the person, and if your grandchildren are doing video games, if you ever spend a dime on buying them anything like that, you need to go get checked out at the mental clinic. The reason I'm saying this so emphatically is it makes the person, this is human nature, want to experience in real life what they experience virtually. That's why pornography is so damaging. That's why showing the pictures of all these people doing ungodly things in the movies and on in TV and whatever, it causes that person to desire. In fact, that desire will eventually, it will eventually take over. So we're not up against a normal foe, are we? So let's look at this. What is then cellular memory? It's the biological ability of cells to retain information from past exposures or events, allowing them to alter their responses to future stimuli, even after the initial signal has disappeared. Goes on and talks about a little bit of extra science here, where it talks about, for example, I'll give you an example. If you had chicken pox, your body's going to always remember that and set up responses to it. But cells, this was important. Cells can respond to various signals from their environment, such as forces, and it can also respond to hormones. Cells can remember forces applied to them, and these changes persist even after the force is removed, influencing what? Cellular behavior. So and I know some of you are going to go back and read this. What about with injury and trauma? Now, we have an expression called a burnt child is afraid to play with matches. The cells of that child's body will respond even to smoke and to certain levels of heat before the child even is able to identify, that was caused by the such and such fire. We understand that. That's a common part of growing up. That is a memory of the trauma. I burned my hand on the stove. The cells in an injured area might retain a memory of the trauma. But what does it lead to? Chronic tension. Do you feel chronic tension all the time? Whether it's from a tornado, whether it is from in other areas of the world, a volcano, earthquakes, there is a constant tension. And if you're in charge of anybody, whether they're young or old or just your family, you have more tension because you're also trying to figure, how can I sort out the universe to keep my family safe? So it leads to a chronic tension. We are a nation in chronic tension. We are a nation in chronic discomfort. Think about how hard we fight for peace. How hard do we fight for a few minutes of peace? And I want to add to that safety. Research has shown that cells remember past mechanical forces, which affect their structure and function, a process crucial for tissue maintenance and adaptation. And I want to give you another example. You've heard of phantom pain. Someone has a limb amputated and it still hurts. So what do they have to do? They have to get in the brain in all sorts of ways to lower the threshold. They can't really get rid of it, but they can lower the threshold of how the body is responding to a limb that is no longer there. This too is cellular memory. So it is a biological response pattern and structural change within the cells or tissue itself. And some of you are already thinking, oh, wow, how much more is there to this? We don't know. We don't even know. It's a new field of study. But I think that it explains a lot of just plain wickedness in the world. And that is the spiritual intention, isn't it? The Bible does say the iniquities of the fathers are visited to the fourth generation. And that's how long it took with the mice. For babies raised away from their parents to no longer fear the smell of cherry blossoms. But what does the scripture say? The scriptures say that his mercies are everlasting. 10,000 upon 10,000 upon 10,000 generations. So there is a way to literally cleanse the blood. There is a way to literally cleanse the blood, and that is by, and I don't apologize for being a woman of faith, through taking on the name and the blood of Jesus. There's a lot more to this than just spiritual. There are transformations that happen. But what about what we know? What are there any things that we can do to help? Well, let's talk about this one. Let's talk about how does NRF1 activation affect traumatic cellular memory. Look at this. Now, this is AI saying this. Activating the NRF1 transcription factor helps clear the cellular damage caused by what? Trauma, which may prevent and resolve aspects of traumatic cellular memory. While traumatic cellular memory is not a formal medical diagnosis, research indicates the physiological stress response to trauma can alter cells through oxidative stress, epigenetic changes, and protein damage. NRF1 combats these effects by activating, listen to this, by activating genetic programs that restore cellular function. Now, you can have a good time after we get off, just going on down here. The conclusion, and this is not a conclusion because you could spend the next week reading all these things. By activating adaptive stress responses, NRF1 helps reverse the molecular damage that defines traumatic cellular memory. It restores the cell's protein clearing mechanisms, boosts antioxidant defenses, and promotes mitochondrial health. While NRF1's primary role is managing cellular damage, these functions provide a potential mechanism for addressing the root cause of trauma, not of trauma, but trauma stored at the cellular level, because that is actually what cellular memory is. Now, let's look at this one. How does activating NRF2 affect cellular memory? Well, according to AI, activating the NRF2 pathway can either reverse pathological cellular memory or improve existing memory and cognitive functions. You can add my name there because you all know my story, depending on its context. Its effect is primarily mediated by regulating antioxidant and anti-inflammatory processes, protecting cellular structures like mitochondria and modulating the epigenome. So, look at this one, reversing pathological memory. In conditions where cellular memory is a negative consequence of past stress, activating NRF2 can help erase that memory. I didn't say that. AI said it. For example, in metabolic memory induced, and they're using a physical example here, by diabetes, NRF2 activation can mitigate long-lasting cellular damage. They go on to talk about diabetes here because what they're talking about is uh, stress, trauma, all of these things contribute to these diseases. Um, you notice here it reverted persistent alterations in gene expression. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about cellular memory, altering gene expression. And they're saying these are linked to inflammation, oxidative stress, and cell senescence. That's the dying off when a cell is supposed to die. Um, the In the brain, NRF2 plays a crucial role in maintaining and improving normal cognitive functions, protecting against cognitive decline, and enhancing synaptic plasticity. That's where it's the signalings. So this goes on, and it's talking so much about things we already know about. But the other thing that it's talking about is that and this is it under the underlying mechanism part of this, NRF2 activation. I'm not talking about a yellow pill. I'm talking about activating the NRF pathway. But we happen to know of a yellow pill that does that, don't we? Can reverse harmful epigenetic alterations by modulating DNA methylation and chromatin accessibility. That just means how the cells are supposed to act. So it can reverse the pathological genetic programming that constitutes cellular memory. I think this is pretty much the last thing I wanted to say on NRF2, but let's get even deeper. How does NAD infusions? Now, the reason I said that is because shortly after I started researching NAD, which was actually before our company came up with the capsules that we have, I was trying to learn how does it affect addictive pathways in the body. And in the course of that, I was privileged to meet the director of a drug treatment clinic, very expensive one. They mainly treat executives that were giving the NAD infusions. Now you see these now practically on every street corner. Some of these little clinics, and you go in and you pay an enormous amount of money to get an IV of NAD because it's so effective. We're privileged that we can just take it every day. But in these infusions, he was telling me about them, and I said, "So what do they do?" And he says it erases the cellular memory of the drug. In other words, you hear about people having flashbacks or memories of drugs and so forth uses. It erases it. Now, they're questioning this because right now it's become so strong in marketing. So he's saying, in reality, these infusions do not literally wipe out the memory of the drugs, but rather help the brain and body heal from the damage that the chronic substance abuse has caused. So we're going to go through this pretty fast, but I wanted you to know that these studies exist. It's not just the healing and regeneration of the damage from drug and alcohol, but it helps to restore normal brain function. And for us, we know that it activates sirtuins, which controls storing food and using food. And so NAD helps to restore the proper function of dopamine and serotonin. Now, this is so important because in almost everyone I've worked with since the 80s, when the psychotropic drugs were introduced around 1974, we began to learn terms like serotonin and dopamine. And dopamine was sort of hanging out there doing nothing for years, we thought. And then I remember seeing them neurotransmitter tests that all of a sudden were showing dopamine so high. I was working with at-risk teenagers at the time, and I went, wait a minute. Every one of these, if I get a metabolic study on them, a neurotransmitter study, they're all having extremely high dopamine. Serotonin's low, but okay, we understand about that. But what does dopamine do? And then shortly thereafter, we found out that the malfunction of dopamine was basically the cause of Parkinson's and the symptoms of Parkinson's, as well as ALS. And we began to find out more about where is this dopamine coming from? Well, it's when you watch an athletic event, you participate in it, you're going to get a big boost of dopamine if you do well, and the crowd applauds. Same thing is true on TV if you're watching. In a video game, dopamine rewards are driven so high and dependency on dopamine becomes so severe, that's why they cannot quit. Their brain is begging. It's begging for more dopamine. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and get an infusion of NAD. This is going on a lot and you need to know about it. Let's look at this one. I don't know how to spell those words. I meant to bring in this earlier in the study, the effect of traumatic events on the heart and circulation. Traumatic events, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and you're like, oh, that's what the guys get in the wars. You have zillions of people who have it right now. If we had meters on the road, on the streets that people drove by or stopped at that could register post-traumatic stress disorder, there's more than you know. This significantly harms the heart and circulation because it triggers the chronic fight or flight. We've talked about that many times. Increasing heart rate, blood pressure, inflammation, which makes a lot of people fat, leading to conditions like arteriosclerosis, increased risk of heart failure, heart attacks, and strokes. So during a traumatic event, stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol surge. You already figured this out. There's more heart rate, elevated blood pressure. All of this, the body's fight or flight response is activated. Okay, once it is activated, how do we get it back down? And does that high fight or flight affect the unborn child? And how does it affect the child in the womb or the child that has never yet even been thought about? So you can read all of this stuff and one of the things I wanted to show you here, behavioral factors, trauma survivors. Now that trauma survivor can be anybody that's been involved up close in the national events that have happened. It can also be involved with people who get so immersed into horror stories and live TV killing. And I'm just like, people, turn off your TV. Trauma survivors may also develop unhealthy habits like what? Poor diet. Do we have a nation of poor diet? Yeah. Lack of exercise. Yeah. Increased substance abuse. And this all makes our bodies worse. But this is the last one I'm going to show you. These are clinical manifestation of body memories, the impact of past bodily experiences on mental health. When you go down and read this long article, it tells you basically, it sort of sums up everything that I'm telling you, that when these events are happening, when these events are happening, and I know many of you've been praying more recently than you ever have, probably for our nation, but we have to apply what we know about the spirit, what we know about the soul, which is the mind, the will, and the emotions, and what we know about the body. We will be looking at the consequences of, I'm just going to say, since 2020, for who knows how many generations. We have a job to do. We have some small little tools What I think they could help everyone, I actually do. That's why I've dedicated these past 15 years to trying to getting this information out. The problem is how do you get people to really make the financial sacrifice that is necessary? When we stop for questions and answers, I want all of you to feel free to say anything you want to say. Okay?